Well, thanks, folks. I think we're off to a really good start, and we appreciate Mr. Klipstein and Mr. Farnan's comments to get us going. Um, Obviously, the issue of climate change has come out in all of the speakers so far, and it probably will be a continuing thread throughout the day. So it's appropriate that our group panel today is on the topic of climate change and resilience, and how the Department of the Army's new climate strategy and installation strategy is going to affect how our installations operate in the future. Especially that interface between the installation and the local community. So we have a really solid lineup of panelists here to be led by our moderator, Mr. Britt Harter from Guidehouse. Guidehouse is one of our national partner companies here at AUSA. Mr. Harter is a partner, and he's part of the energy sustainability and infrastructure practice at Guidehouse. And with that, I'll turn it over to Britt. Over to you, sir.
Good morning. Thank you all very much. We're excited. All right. We're ready here for our climate and resilience panel. I had somebody ask me this morning while we were having coffee if I was a professional moderator, and I will prove to you in the next 50 minutes that I'm not. So we have a wonderful panel here today to talk about climate and resilience. We have the Honorable Sharon Burke from Ecospherics. We have Lynn McConnell from Grid Assurance, and we have Mark McVey from Dominion Energy. And so climate and resilience is obviously a big topic, one that was well covered by Paul Farnan, and one that will prepare us to work our way into the future. From a Guidehouse perspective, we work closely both in the Army as well as in the energy and sustainability space. We partner with the G9 on utilities privatization. We're the GSA's primary partner for electric vehicle preparation. We're the VA's primary partner for climate vulnerability and building sustainability. And we work closely with a number of REITs in the private sector, bringing private sector experience, REITs, and really just about everything in your cabinet and on your body in terms of the preparation for net zero and resilience. So we have three wonderful speakers. They're going to share a little bit of their perspective on what they've just heard, coming out of what Paul's heard, and then we'll have time for questions. So first off, I'll turn it over to Sharon.
Thank you, Britt, for the introduction. So I just got to tell you all that I had a great weekend. I got together with a whole bunch of friends I haven't seen since the pandemic started. We went out, we went to brunch, and yesterday one of us tested positive for COVID. So my gift to you is wearing this mask. I have tested negative so far, but better safe than sorry. So I was really looking forward to a mask-free conference, but not today, not this time, maybe next week. So, I mean, the pandemic of course, continues to loom in our peripheral vision, but it's really all about Ukraine and Russia's war in Ukraine. And, you know, I, with a background in energy, particularly concerned about the disruption to the energy markets and what it's doing to prices, and the prospect of a very real supply crisis, which is pretty unprecedented. For the most part, there's always been enough supply in the market. And the markets have corrected for price disruptions in the past, including even when many years ago OPEC did its embargo. But this is different. So, you know, this is front of mind for all of us, and I think particularly for all of you, given that you know this is an unprecedented war, and the risks are almost overwhelming. But I do want to remind you that behind those headlines that we're understandably all preoccupied with, there's been also some very devastating headlines on climate change. Just in the last couple of days, there's been scientists have attributed the 2020 hurricane season, just how bad it was, which was almost historically bad, to climate signals. It was wetter than normal, which just means a lot more rain, which is a lot more destructive. A iceberg the size of New York City broke off of the East Antarctic ice sheet, which is bad news in of itself, but much worse because that wasn't expected. And if it's an indicator of the melting of that ice sheet, that's a tipping point, which would be disastrous. So it's very much not good news. The IPCC, the UN, just put out a new report that says that this is unequivocal and unavoidable, and we are rapidly heading towards a point of no return, and that greenhouse gas emissions have continued to grow. That's the latest out of the UN. that we are hitting record highs in greenhouse gas emissions. So we're hurtling ahead with no signs that we're going to be able to pull back. I know that this is a topic that there are probably people in the room aren't comfortable talking about it or even saying the words climate change. I understand that. And in fact, I recently spoke to a former colleague who's still active duty general officer who said when he talks about it, he's worried that he's going to get described as a woke general. But this is happening. This is happening. And if you're still not sure, then you need to look at the overhead imagery of the Arctic and understand that for the first time in human history, there's going to be an open ocean there in our lifetimes, almost certainly. This is happening, and you need to get comfortable with the fact that it's happening. You don't necessarily have to talk about it if you don't want to talk about it, but just because it's political doesn't mean you shouldn't plan for it. Like, Iran is political too. There's a lot of partisan divide on how to handle Iran and what to do, but that's not going to stop the Army from planning for operations there should that happen. I would encourage you to think of climate change the same way, that whatever you think about the dialogue and the diversity of opinion on it, it is something that is happening and we have to plan for it. So this is a challenge that does not respect borders or boundaries, including the fence line of a military base. It is a shared challenge for bases and for the communities around them, and there needs to be a shared investment in resilience. And the Army's climate strategy is a really important step ahead. And I want to talk to you for four basic reasons why I think it's really important. First of all, it is not an outlier. If you looked at that strategy and thought, oh my God, that is so bold and so unachievable and so out there, it is not. It is right in line with best practices in the commercial industry. And I could see in my peripheral vision that Britt Harter is nodding. And I know that he spends a lot of time working with those companies. This is what companies are doing. They are both shrinking their greenhouse gas footprints, and they are also adapting to the changes. You see it in companies like Amazon that are changing the way they power their data centers. They're locating where the power supply is both high quality and renewable. You see it with big companies all over the economy are taking the environment, social, and governance requirements very seriously and making those investments. The Army is right in line with that, and late to need on some level, behind the curve. So this is, and by the way, this is what investors want to see. You're increasingly seeing investor activism. Most recently, I saw Rio Tinto, which I'll get to the minerals question. Rio Tinto, the world's biggest mining operation, is dealing with activist investors that want them to be more aggressive about their own footprint, because mining is a very energy intensive operation. Municipalities are moving ahead on this because they have to, because the risk profiles have shifted. And they must deal with droughts and floods, changing patterns of rainfall, all of this. They don't have a choice, they have to. So this is moving ahead. That's first. Secondly, I'm also really appreciated Mr. Klippenstein's comments this morning, because the Army climate strategy is very consistent with the Army's past strategies, with the installation strategy and also the energy and water strategy. The Army Climate Resilience Handbook, and those three came out in the last administration. And I know Jordan Gillis is back there somewhere, and Lucian Niemeyer is here. They did a lot of work to move forward on sustainability. Things like microgrids are a long-standing priority for the Army, especially at the tactical level where it's a no-brainer. This is consistent with minimizing the risks to bases, making them better, more sustainable, safer places to live and train and operate, and to make them more resilient to shocks and stresses, which are becoming more frequent and more expensive. We have to shift the mindset, so we're not just waiting for the bad things to happen and responding. We're getting on the front end of that curve and making the investments in resilience to dampen the costs and the human cost of all of these disasters and shocks that are becoming more frequent. Now, there are some differences in the Army climate strategy from the past strategy. The emphasis on cutting greenhouse gases, especially at installations. But again, I would point out that is best practices industry with the commercial sector. It can be done, and it can be done in a way that modernizes your bases. It's a win-win possibility. incorporating climate change into the acquisition process. The department's already had a couple of RFIs that are sort of warning shots that this is coming, asking industry how they're handling their scope 3 emissions, which is in your supply chain, basically. And then also asking for how various companies such as Guidehouse actually calculate greenhouse gas footprints. They've already put those out, and you heard, I think, Mr. Farnan refer to a memo that the Deputy Secretary is moving through the process right now, which is to strengthen the energy key performance parameter in the acquisition process. That is statutory. It is required by law. It is lightly implemented at this point, and they're looking for how to implement it in a more significant way. This is about improving performance. The measure is not just how much does energy cost you when you operate, but what's the military efficacy of an improvement in your energy performance. And I think we've all got a pretty good object lesson in what it looks like when you have a big military that's not taken care of in garrison and doesn't value sustainment on the battlefield in the shape of the Russian forces. So to put a value on energy performance in the acquisition process and to comply with the law is not at all a bad thing. Being prepared for a climate altered world. So one thing you hear people like Mr. Farnan saying is that electric vehicles are going to become more prevalent in the commercial sector. The supply chain for internal combustion vehicles is going to become more problematic. You have to move with the times, but also as far as the climate altered world, I think there are some other interesting issues in there, including minerals, which, by the way, it's not just renewable energy that requires cobalt, lithium, rare earth elements. It's this thing, it's, MRIs, knee replacements, infrastructure. There's a whole suite of new metals, critical materials for which the demand has skyrocketed over the last 20 years, and our modern economy depends on them. We need to strengthen that supply chain for all kinds of reasons, including, by the way, a lot of military technology, precision weapons, you name it, depend on a steady supply of these materials. That means we do need to improve our domestic supply, but also diversify our international supply. The previous administration worked on that. This administration is taking very significant steps forward. That is something we have to do no matter what. That's not just about clean energy. The mission risk is also, I think, really important because climate change is going to change the operating environment in ways we have to anticipate and be ready for, but it's also going to raise the risk of instability worldwide. So countries that are already, say, in Sahelian Africa, Mali, Niger, where we have a military base, already are challenged by their own climate already. It's, austere, it's dry, they have growing populations. You just shift the precipitation patterns a little bit, and you've already got governments that aren't very stable, then you've got millions of people on the move, and it empowers VEOs. It's a problem that we have to anticipate. It's a problem for China, right? They can barely feed their own people right now. About 43% of their landmass is potentially cultivable. As rain patterns shift, as their water availability shifts, as heat goes up, where they can grow is going to change, and who they want to be their allies for those reasons is also going to change. We need to understand that better. But then finally, the climate strategy is also about opportunities. This is about improvements in our ability to recruit and retain forces, a more resilient and agile army. Electrification of tactical vehicles is something that there's been research on for decades because it's an improvement in the way that the vehicle operates, not just on its sustainment footprint. Both of those are important, right? This is about having smart 21st century bases that are ready for 21st century threats and equipment. This is about that shared investment stream for bases and for the communities around them. There's a lot of money going into these programs, ERSIP, and then also the Defense Community Infrastructure Program. Again, these threats and the utilities don't stop at the fence line, so the money isn't either. And I think that's a very promising thing. And then I just want to finish with where I started with Russia. So one of the reasons that Putin is what he is and can do what he does is because, unlike the United States, where we have private ownership of our mineral rights, he owns the minerals. and he skims a hell of a lot of money off the top and then redistributes it as political power to the people around him. As long as we depend on oil and gas, and the whole world does, this is a global price, certainly for oil, increasingly for gas, it empowers him. That's just the way it is. So the solution to dealing with climate risk is the same as dealing with the Putin risk, that we have to take some of that money out of his pocket. And the only way to do that is to get off of oil and gas, and especially oil, the sooner the better. So it all fits together: energy security, climate security, mission risk, and creating a more resilient and agile army. So I think it's a really promising thing that the Army has taken such a pragmatic but next war approach to these issues. And I'll stop there, and certainly happy to answer more questions.
Thank you. So I'm sure you have a million questions for Sharon. The way we're going to structure, we're going to have each of our panelists speak for just a little bit, and then we'll have a big, rich, open discussion. So, thank you for tying that. I think tying that to the pragmatism of how climate and preparing for climate relates to the success of the Army is absolutely essential. And I love the way that you did that. So this is Lynn McConnell. Can you speak to us a little bit as well from Grid Assurance?
Certainly. Excuse me. Good morning. I am the Director of Finance and Business Administration for Grid Assurance. Grid Assurance is a product of an industry-led initiative to address the growing threats to the U.S. bulk electric system. As Sharon pointed out, the events on this slide that you're looking at currently could be updated weekly, if not daily. Something is always happening to impact the bulk electric system, be it related to climate or physical attack. And Grid Assurance was developed to quickly bring the bulk electric system back up following one of these events. So what is Grid Assurance? So Grid Assurance is a cost-effective industry-led program that pulls critical long lead time transmission assets among subscribers, enabling quick recovery from low frequency, high impact events that cause the bulk electric system outages, such as catastrophic weather or terrorist attacks. Grid Assurance provides its subscribers, which include 31 transmission-owned affiliates with operations in 23 states, with certainty, speed, and simplicity to bulk power restoration and resilience planning. So how does Grid accomplish this? Grid Assurance worked closely with an analytical modeling firm to develop a multi-step process to assess risk and optimize target inventory levels, allowing subscribers to realize pooling benefits and savings while maintaining a high reliability service level. Currently, Grid's inventory is comprised of extra high voltage transformers, circuit breakers, and bushings. This equipment comprises some of the most vulnerable components of the electric grid. They have long manufacturing and lead times, and they are essential to the functioning of the electrical system. So what Grid does at this point in time is we have subscribers that pool their assets with our company. And if there is an event, they call Grid, and Grid can provide this asset to them on a timely basis. By purchasing in advance, this allows utilities to better scrutinize manufacturers and suppliers. It also allows subscribers to know exactly what equipment they will be receiving. They have the specs already, which enables quick recovery and restoration. At this point in time, it could take almost 2 years to receive a transformer if you were to order it today, and Grid can have it into your system within 4 weeks. The Grid Assurance solution makes sense by providing a cost-effective solution for recovery from these catastrophic outages. By pooling, utilities can save money on capital, enabling them to deploy their assets and capital and other programs that help customers. Customers or ratepayers save because their utilities can share the cost of the spare equipment, allowing the utilities to put the money into programs that affect the customers today and make their reliability better today. So Grid Assurance offers a program that has the equipment that can get the grid back up and running, and the programs and the plans to allow for resilience and restoration planning.
Fantastic, thank you. I think an interesting look at, as we talk about partnerships and as we talk about the tension within partnerships. We want to partner, we want to get out into the community, we want to work with suppliers, but at the same time, we want everything inside the fence line. We want to control it. We want to make sure that it's safe. We want to make sure that it's ours. And so I think, this is certainly an interesting solution, straddling that tension and allowing both. Mr. Mark, can you talk to us for a little bit?
Sure. I put the clock on me this morning because my presentation typically is about 2 hours, and I'm going to shorten it into about 5 minutes here.
I threatened them all yesterday.
Dominion Energy is a large electrical utility company that we actually have business in 19 states, and it's an energy company. We don't just deal with electricity. We cover all aspects of storage, gas transmission. Well, we've reduced our footprint for gas transmission. We still have a very large gas distribution organization, but wanted to get you an idea that we're a pretty good sized company. And so we're well connected within the United States. One of the things that we're talking about today is just climate resilience, but resilience is a multivariant problem. That's just one sector of what you need in order to maintain resilience. As you can see here, we're just covering the natural events, but we also have things you have in recent times, the McConnell event, you've got man-made terrorism. And also one of the things that we've talked about is the change in our grid, which is the change in our generation source to more inverter-based generation. All of that change brings new risks and things that we have to develop. We talked about battery storage. Battery storage is something that we're experimenting with really on a large scale basis, but it's not ready for prime time, as well as many of these renewables are not ready for prime time. Most everybody thinks that renewables and how we're going to integrate those with climate change, that is a mature technology. Unfortunately, it's not. We're kind of at the point where we're going from Windows 3.0 to Windows 98. That'll tell you my age. I've got 40 years in the industry. And so we're not ready to get to Windows XP yet. That's where the microgrids come in. And that's where Dominion Energy is doing a lot of work in that area to do the study piece. And I'll back that up in a minute because we're actually working nationally, internationally with folks to do that. So our resilience strategy at Dominion is to assess, prevent, and detect. And where that comes in is the different resiliency aspects that we're looking at. And then we are only going to design not from a fortress that we're going to resolve everything, but you never know where those threats are going to come from. Just like a tornado, if I designed every substation, every asset to satisfy an F5, nobody could afford the power, including the folks in this building here. So what you do is you build up to a certain point, and then you look at your recovery and rapid restoration of service. And what we've done is develop technologies that are unique in the industry, unique not only just in the U.S., but also for the world. And we're involved in that for transmission technologies. Most people have these distribution substations. If they have a failure, they could do that up. But we've done that also at the transmission level to be able to move those in to do rapid recovery for our generation resources. A big part of this resiliency strategy is develop modeling. The old way that we used to look at things, you do what they call N-1. So we take an asset out. Then maybe N-2 is what the folks do as far as the way that they look at the grid. We've developed models to do N-K. What we do is we stress the system. We find out where those places are to prevent cascade failure. So we work with the best minds in the industry. As you can see, we have worked with our RTOs, but also with Oak Ridge National Labs with the current center there, which we also use as a talent pool. One of the things you heard about here is the workforce development. That's a big part of what we have as well in our industry. We've had a lot of retirements, but also retooling our companies specifically for those skill sets that we need for the future. The sophistication of the grid is far beyond what it was 40 years ago when I got into this business. Right now, Dominion Energy is also partnering with DoD and DOE and several of the national labs specifically to look at this resiliency. And we have 2 test cases for the privatizations that we've done within Dominion to look at both inside the fence and outside the fence to come together to figure out what those things that we can do together, specifically interdependency. I mean, we just talk about the electricity as one of those things independent, but you also have phone, communication, water. All of those pieces affect your ability for your core functions and how we work within those communities to improve all of those features in the grid. And then I'm right at 5 minutes. One of the things that we do, and again, some of the things we do to mitigate for one thing also work for extreme weather. And so you have our center. We also do physical security and cyber. We look at multiple threats. What happens if we have a hurricane, but also there's a cyber threat at the same time? We have our fusion center that we put together that's also hooked up with organizations like the FBI and governmental organizations that we look at these threats to make sure that for our mission assurance, we can support you as a customer. Anyways, that's the short piece of it, but there's a lot more into it that we design specifically for severe and extreme weather. And we do that through our asset management program. We started this probably back about 25 years ago. We didn't get into the situation we've got with our grid overnight, and we're probably not going to get out of it overnight. But if we can teach the next generation how to deal with this through their asset management, we don't have to throw trillions of dollars at the grid as we age these things out, as we look at resiliency models for, say, sea level rise and severe weather. We can elevate substations. We can move assets along with that grid. And that's part of what we try and do within the industry, is to try and work on these problems and teach the next generation. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Mark. All right. We've made it through the lecture portion of the program and into the interactive. So, I mean, I think one of the things that's most interesting about this panel and this moment is both the word climate and the word resilience, very broad. It can be, different people can bring their own approaches to it. When we think about climate, we can think about the impacts of climate, the volatile weather that can harm and knock out our ability both to deliver electricity and to deliver and project force. We can also think about our need to impact that, mitigation and adaptation. How can we reduce our own reliance on the kinds of fuels that bring that create those harms in the long term? And from a resilience standpoint, we talk about the ability to withstand a shock. And when you say that, boy, do people start naming a lot of shocks, whether it's to the grid, whether it's to EMP, whether it's to black swan shocks we've never thought about and we do hear a lot of private sector companies starting to work this through using enterprise risk management approaches, COSO approaches to try to prepare and be resilient, not just to the last thing that happened to them, but to really think in a strategic and structured way about what might happen to them. I have a wonderful question here around data and measurement. How does the Army measure installation sustainability? Both in backward looking and then also how to prioritize actions going forward. And so I think I would direct that to Sharon, and you can take it both in a specific, how are they doing it today, but also sort of a broader, what would be a meaningful approach.
I don't actually know the answer to how the Army is measuring sustainability and performance metrics. One thing I would say is I'm really interested in what Mark was talking about with the way that they're doing risk assessment, because I don't think that that military components have good risk assessment tools that incorporate in climate change. So I think that's a challenge at this point, is however we're measuring our sustainability goals and our performance metrics, to incorporate that kind of risk assessment in. And I'm curious if your tools are shareable with your partners.
Yeah, actually, Yeah, actually, what we did was one of the tools that most planners use now is a piece of software called PSSE, but it's a planning software. And we developed a package that sits on top of that, another program called Python. We have supplied this package to the Department of Energy so that it allows other planners to be able to do this N-K analysis of their system to eliminate this cascade failure. We did that in response to the event that happened at McConnell, because basically PG&E was pretty lucky that when that physical attack occurred, it occurred at a time that they had the flexibility to move load around. If it happened at the wrong time, that could have led to a cascade failure in California. So in response to that, we have looked at our grid, and then also our physical security plan. The first part was gathered around those stations where we had, that was one of the things that my boss sent me around the world to look at all of the different technologies that we could use and apply strategies for physical security. But we also do the same thing from a weather standpoint. In the country right now, we've been pretty lucky that most of the black start that we have has not really been black start. It's because we've got neighbors that we can lean on after a hurricane to restart your system. We've not had a true black start in a very long time. And now with the grid transformation, we're actually doing studying specifically to look at inverter-based resources on how you would use those to quick start your system. We have the largest real-time digital simulator in the United States in our lab at Grayland Avenue. And so we've actually got our 500-230 system modeled in there to be able to do these types of studies. So it's a little unique situation over most of the utilities, but we share this. It's things that we talk about when we go to IEEE with other utilities. And I have a number of utilities that actually visit there to look to see what we're doing as a best practice in the industry. And the key is to adapt the talent to come in to be able to run those systems.
And I think it's a good example because for the department, there is a defense climate assessment tool that's defense enterprise wide that does measure vulnerability of bases to climate impacts. It's being improved now. That came out of the Army Corps of Engineers, which I think was a really great step forward. And it's being improved now to add other dimensions such as exposure and to make it a more useful tool to inform investments on the back end. And then there's also a requirement in law to improve sustainability metrics and performance metrics in the space. It's I know that the OSD folks continue to wrestle with that because at the end of the day, what you're trying to measure is again the return on military efficacy, not just sustainability in the sense that is our grid functional, but is our military getting closer to its military goals? And it's really hard to figure out how to measure sustainability in that context. But now there's a legal compulsion to do that.
That makes great sense. I mean, when we think about some of those metrics, and when we think about the climate risk, I think one of the interesting things we're seeing, certainly in the private sector and in some of the other public entities, especially across the world, is a look not just at physical risk, but also at transition risk. What about when people move? What about when you have them using a lot of heating and cooling? What does that do to your planning, your capital structure, the entities, locations, and physical preparations that you need? I'm getting wonderful questions here. I want to do them all. I don't know that I will have time. The first question here, are the plans nested within DHS, the FEMA, and other relevant strategies around recovery? And I will say that Guidehouse is the primary resilience partner for FEMA in terms of organizing their disaster response. And so I will speak to a little bit of that connection, and then I will give this also to both of our partners around how they're connected, because it's really a wonderful question of, okay, we're imagining a moment in which something bad happens, whether it's a big storm, whether it's a big threat actor power outage. How do we work together to get back up? How do we make sure that that the Army installation is not only an island, is not reliant only on itself, but can take advantage of some of these other agencies who are thinking very hard about the same thing? And that's one of the things we did, in Joplin, Missouri, where we supported the recovery after they had a massive hurricane to build to a level of resilience and a preparation that would allow them to stand the next one. So I'll ask Lynn first. When you think about that, when you think about how do we work together with with DHS, with FEMA for when that bad moment comes? How do you guys think about that?
Yes, that's a good question. Grid was developed out of an initiative from the government to try to, harden the grid, if you will, make sure that we can keep our power up and running. And the industry thought, well, we're going to get in front of this. We want to be architects of our system versus having someone else tell us how to do this, so to speak. So that's why several of the utilities pulled together to create this company, to create this reserve of equipment. Now, at this point in time, it's a private company, so you can subscribe to it. That said, if there is an event somewhere in the nation and we have a piece of equipment that can address that need, we will do that. That's part of our whole operating process, is to be a restoration of power for not just subscribers. It's for reserve for the bulk electric system, if you will. So if there is an event and someone would need equipment and get it there and we have it, we would do that. So that's how Grid is establishing that.
Fantastic. I've got another good one here about highlighting SCADA, sort of cyber resilience, as we bring the technologies as we move to call it microgrids tied to renewables with batteries, partnered across with utility redundancy. How do we make sure that these new things are secure to our threat actors? So Mark, how do you guys think about that, both in obviously a legacy context, but also with some of these emerging technologies, which I think will have new cyber threats?
You've hit on one of the things. I do a lot of work in the industry at the transmission level. Most of you see us as a utility as a completely integrated entity, but we're not anymore. The force to move towards the market has broken the utilities up into different businesses. So you have generation, you have transmission, and you have distribution. And in some cases, the utilities are only distribution utilities. Those people are regulated by the states. And unfortunately, those bases that are fed by distribution systems lack many of the standards that we have today. And most of the renewables that we have today are going in at the distribution level. So when you have a solar site that's set up, they're very loose with that cyber piece. At the transmission level, for probably 18 years, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission has a series of standards that they put on us specifically towards cyber. And so we have a number of requirements from a federal regulatory requirement, as well as the way that we design, spec, and have replaced that equipment that provide many of those gaps in processes to prevent things that you saw in Plantation Pipeline. What I have with the DOE and my fax devices for ICS, DOE thinks that I have the gold standard in what I do, because we actually start whitelisting at the manufacturer. We come and we have actually a sanitizer for all of that software. So the vulnerability would be at the manufacturer site. Then I have hardware in the loop. I actually have the equipment in my lab that I can simulate just like it's out in the field. So I can actually see how it reacts and how it communicates before it ever goes out of that quarantine and goes out to the field. And then we have protocols specifically for those devices that are they never see the light of day in the internet. They live all the way from the development all the way out to the system. And then we also use this process in our patch management. So we prevent, you can't do things like plug thumb drives and things like that in. I go to the manufacturers, and after I whitelist, I'm literally blocking and taking pictures of every port, every communication. I have port locks that I put on there. I have tapes that I put on there. And then after inspection, when it gets to port, when we take it off the boat, I also am whitelisting. I'm making sure that the software, I look at the metadata, and the metadata has to match up. If it doesn't, immediately that piece or component of the device has to come down. So there's a lot that happens on the transmission end, but we have concerns about the distribution piece that is regulated by the states. And so you have 50 different regulators, all with different ideas, and a large portion of the new generation is coming in at that level and does have vulnerability, particularly because these developers, these third parties, they're remotely operating these stations. So they're dial-up. So the things you hear about that people are worried about that some kid with a computer somewhere. I worry about that as well, and developing those standards specifically across the grid to harden it in the same way that we do with all the SIP requirements that we have at the transmission level.
Well, yeah, that's a really good point. It's something that we saw in the smart city connected communities world. We're working in a number with the TVA in San Jose as well, and making sure that the technologies that you bring online are mature and secure when you're using critical functions is absolutely important. I saw everybody lean in on this topic, so I think it's something that people have a lot of interest in. I guess first Lynn and then Sharon.
Yes, and to echo what Mark was saying, a lot of what those standards are and the fact that you're able to implement those, it's because you're doing this in advance. If you're handling this on an emergency situation, you may not be able to take all that time and go through all those tests and do all of that. So that's part of what Grid has done. We have this equipment and we've scrubbed it the same way, but you have time to do that when you're planning in advance. If you're just reacting and you have to get a transformer or a circuit breaker from the manufacturer like this, you're not quite sure exactly what components are in there and where those circuits came from and things like that, where if you can take some time up front, you can ensure that you've made sure it's clean and that you don't have that in there.
Great point. And I think it speaks to, when we bring these new climate technologies into the Army, we need to bring them in a context with organizations that know a lot about the Army, the DoD. You can't, you've heard me talk about bringing private sector experience and knowledge into the public sector, into defense, but there's an important defense knowledge component that makes it both appropriately secure and operational within that context. There was a great question for Sharon here about looking at this is, the Army climate strategy is very big, and how do they, or how would you prioritize among what you see in the climate strategy with an eye both towards funding and obviously towards that pragmatic, resilient, but also preparing for the future?
I think that's a great question, and it's a very ambitious strategy that has some, 2035, 2050 goals that it's an interesting question about exactly how are they going to fund that and when are they going to fund it. And, Paul didn't quite give us the answer yet, partly because the budget this year hit each other coming and going. And, with the last year's budget only passing on March 15th, still sorting through. But I think that what I hear out of him in particular is that they're going to take an approach that is ambitious in certain places, like on electric vehicles. That's clearly a priority. The commander-in-chief has made that clear on the, even in the campaign, that they're going to use the federal fleet as an accelerant of innovation there. So I think you will see electric vehicles, and he mentioned it, both the vehicles and the charging infrastructure. They are going to be looking, absolutely, they're going to get some money for that out of the budget, but they're also going to be looking to use third-party financing tools to accomplish some of those goals. So this is, there's a lot of creative financing in there that's possible. I think they need to figure out how to do that in the most sensible way, so that they need, they don't even understand their own infrastructure right now, right? Like, where are their charging stations already? Where is it going to make the most sense? There are some charging stations that can be completely off grid and combined with a microgrid, but we've got to understand better the dimensions of the challenge and the opportunities. So I think that's going to be a first mover. The microgrids, that's been going on for a while. And again, bringing a more strategic, methodical approach to how we're going to implement those and where, with partners that have an interest in doing that. And again, there's ways to leverage other people's money to do that. The big one that I find fascinating too is the clean energy goals by 2035. That's pretty ambitious. And of course, the Army does not own those assets. They do. So how is that going to unfold? How exactly you're going to hit a mark that's that ambitious is a really good question, and we haven't heard yet. So again, what I'm really encouraged by is the way that your Army leaders are talking about it. They're going to be sensible, and they're going to ground this in the Army's mission, and they're going to ground this in overall modernization goals. So, for example, one of the biggest energy footprint, operational energy changes is going to be unmanned systems. They use energy fundamentally differently. They use different energy, and they're changing force structure in general. So some of the things that are going to come in here are not necessarily going to be, you have to throw away what you're doing. It's going to be about the way that the Army is changing. So it sounds ambitious, but I think it's ambitious in concert with the Army's overall goals for being ready for the next war. So I think it's achievable, and the really good question is, where are they going to put their money now? And hopefully we'll find that out soon.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. I heard the little alarm on the phone, which is the same alarm that goes off when my daughter is watching PBS Kids. And she says, Dad, 2 more minutes, but we are all grown-ups and professionals. So I'd like to please give a round of applause to Sharon Burke, Lynn McConnell, and Mark McVey. Thank you guys. Thank you so much. You guys were wonderful.
Okay, keep your seats, folks, because we're going to go right into the next panel. And then we'll take a short break before we get Secretary Panetta. So, General Smith.